Oh, I forgot my watch.
There you go.
I guess I could be a kid and just leave. Do we have power there? I guess we do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
In case you didn't notice it, apparently there's a group of people who are trying to launch the largest treasure hunt. The mic's off. The mic's on, but it's not turned up enough. Just need volume. It'll come. Anyways, around us, there's the largest treasure hunt in the world going on. A group of people are trying to run that off. We've seen lots of people out in the street. That's apparently what that's about. But we know where the treasure is, the real treasure. That's why we're here. Hello, Carlo. Good to see you. Hard not to see you. Hey, it looks like most of the food got left back there. What's going on? Oh, wow. I know I missed mine. I had to do some homework. In the time of Jesus and the apostles, if you were called a Corinthian, you were considered a carouser, probably very sexually permissive. Did very shady business deals, including stealing, probably into human trafficking, and even murder if necessary. But when you came to know Jesus, even living in the city of Corinth, life changed. And so Paul wrote this to those people who had come to Jesus in that city. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. Quite a change in lifestyle for those few people who gathered on a Sunday morning in Corinth to worship Jesus. The first time we bump into the concept of a temple was through Moses, when God directed him to build the tabernacle. And it was very specific directions that were given for that. It was to be God's holy area. And the whole temple, the whole tabernacle was built by volunteer help. There was maybe one guy that came from Tyre. Maybe he was paid. But almost everybody else volunteered their time, and they volunteered the material to build it. And it was a very costly procedure. We see the concept of the temple developed even further when Solomon built his first temple. And the purpose of the temple God wanted it was to be a picture of two things. It was to be a picture of where God lived. So it was like his house, like his home. It's where he lived. But it was also to be a picture of his throne, where he was to reign amongst his people. And from that position, he would issue judgments and offer decisions for problems and counseling if people wanted to come and share an issue that they had. It said that a priest could come and actually talk to God by sitting outside the curtain that separated from the holy to the Holy of Holies, and he could actually talk with God. And you could talk to your priest. He could go on your behalf and talk about your problem and say, we've got this problem, what's your solution? And God would talk to him. And so Israel was taught that this is where God lived. This is where God dwelt. This is where God reigned. But the holiness of that tabernacle or that temple was only as good as the people who protected it, the people who maintained it, and the people who came and worshiped there. It was not a magical, superstitious kind of holiness that was there. It had to be real. It had to actually be happening in people's lives for it to actually be a holy place. In the early days, this temple was greatly respected, was greatly looked after, especially in Solomon's time. People treated it properly and honored it. But that didn't go on for long. Pretty soon, the people and even the kings began to worship idols. They began to turn away from God. They began to turn away from the judgments that he would have issued from his holy temple. There were holy and righteous kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, but most of the kings of Israel turned away from God. And even Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, he actually took idols and put them in God's temple. He actually took his sons and his daughters and he offered them as sacrifices to Moloch, and completely reversed everything that God had intended for his temple. And so, to get Manasseh's attention, God has to do rough things to get our attention at times. He allowed the king of Syria to come and invade Palestine, and he captured King Manasseh. He put him in shackles, and he dragged him off to Babylon. And in Manasseh's mind, the game was over. He had had his opportunity, and he was likely going to die in a prison in Babylon. While he was there, and he thought about his past, thought about his father, thought about what had been going on in God's temple when it was run properly, he decided that he needed to change his ways. And so it tells us that he repented, that he humbled himself before God, and he gave his heart back to God in a place where there was no temple, at least not God's temple. And miraculously, the king of Assyria allowed him to go back home. That did not happen when kings took people into exile. They didn't let them usually go back home, especially the king. Usually the king was kept alive so they could make fun of him, so they could parade him around, so they could put him in their ceremonies and poke fun at him, make fun of him, and eventually kill him. But God, in his mercy, allowed Manasseh to return home. And when he got home, he restored worship into God's temple. He tore down the idols, cleaned out the temple, and encouraged the priests to once again use it as the way God had wanted it. Percy was about 6 years old when he had his first bottle of beer. He found that bottle of beer in the bottom of the well where his father would keep his beer. And watching his father drink and having fun with his companions, and then they left one bottle of beer in the bottom of the well. Percy found it, popped it, and had the most exciting experience of his life. For the rest of his life, he always looked back to that shining bottle of beer in the bottom of the well. And living on a farm, one of the staples of the farm was hard apple cider. His father made it by the barrel, so that when Mom and Dad were away, they never detected Percy and his brothers opening a barrel and drinking all they wanted. And so Percy grew in his drinking career. By the time he was in his 20s, he realized that he had a serious drinking problem. And he needed to do something about it. And so, though he had a wife with the third child on the way, he decided what he needed to solve his drinking problem was more discipline. If he could just be more disciplined, he could beat this thing. So he decided he would join the army. That's where they teach you discipline. So Percy joined the army. But in 1942, World War II was going on. And Percy got shipped out, had to leave his wife and his family. Because he was a baker, they shipped him to England, where they put him through cooking school and turned him into a full-fledged chef. Following cooking school, he was sent to South Italy to help the Canadian forces fight their way through South Italy. And of course, when you're the cook, and you got access to all of the food stores for the troops, and you have an addiction, it's not hard to take some of those goods and to trade it for some of the best cognac in Italy. And that's what Percy did. And so Percy would begin his day with a kettle of hot wine on the stove. That kettle never went dry. And no matter how isolated his troops got, he could always find a wine cellar, because every Italian had one. And he could trade food for wine. And so Percy went through the Second World War. Needless to say that when he returned home 5 years later, he was 5 times worse the alcoholic than the alcoholic that had left 5 years earlier. He was in deep trouble now. He found that it was beginning to affect his mind. And so because he was military, he was allowed to enter into a veterans military hospital for help. And he would go periodically and get sober, get clean, get dry. It was okay for a while. But eventually pressure, life, whatever it was, led him back to drinking. And in and out, and in and out, and in and out of this hospital he went. Finally, the psychiatrist told his wife that they diagnosed Percy with severe alcohol psychosis. And based on his record, they had tried so many medications on him, they had given him so many opportunities to change his life. But when Percy drank, he became violent. Percy would smash a milk bottle and threaten to kill his wife and throw all his kids in a corner and threaten to kill them. The psychiatrist realized that he was a danger to himself and to society. So they told his wife the only solution for Percy was for permanent residence in a psychiatric hospital under lock and not be able to get out. And so Percy was committed to a veterans hospital, psychiatric ward, locked in, and that was going to be life. About 5th year into that experience, Percy realized the truth that this was it. This was how he was going to end his life. And so, in a fit of desperation, even though he was in a ward of other mentally ill veterans, one day he got down on his knees by his bed, and he said, "God, you're the only one who can ever help me get out of here." A few days later, he heard through the grapevine that the kitchen was very short of qualified chefs. And he bumped into the head chef one day. And he quickly said to him, "If I heard you need help in the kitchen, if ever you need a volunteer, I'm available. The name's Ruby." Happens to be my father. A couple days later after that, he got an invitation to do a shift in the kitchen of the hospital. And so began the recovery of Percy Ruby. There were still many years to go, but he rose up through the ranks of the chefs. And within a very short time, he became the chef for the doctors and the nurses at that hospital. Finally, the doctor said, "Percy, if you will move your family to this city, and you promise to keep this job, we will release you." And they released him. And Percy got his mind back, he got his job back, he got his family back. And he died as a successful businessman with God's help. Getting back to the 2 Chronicles 33, where we were with Manasseh. His son, Manasseh's son, Ammon, rejected everything that his father believed, threw it all out, desecrated the temple again. But he had a son. His son was Josiah. His son turned back to God. Josiah turned back to God. But Josiah was the last king of Israel, king of Judah, really, who turned back to God. None of the other kings that followed after him came back to God. Until finally in 722 BC, God sent the Babylonians. And they destroyed Jerusalem. They desecrated the temple. And they took everyone away as exiles to Babylon. For 70 years, the exiles lived in a mental hospital of a sort, locked away from the temple that God had given them, where they were to worship him. And while in exile, there was one of those exiles who had gone there as a boy, probably was made a eunuch, was made to work and got a job working for the government there, but who never lost the concept that though the temple had been destroyed in Palestine, God could still build a temple in his life. Most Jews gave up. They lost their land, they lost their law, they lost their priesthood, they lost their temple, and it's all over. And many never went any further with their faith in God. But there were a few, like Daniel, who believed that though I cannot worship God in his temple back there, I can build his temple in my life. And that's what he did. He had a full-time job, worked for the government. But whenever the opportunity came, he tried to help other people. He tried to encourage his own people to not lose faith, to believe that someday God would take them back. And whenever the opportunity came, he used the gifts of the Spirit to minister to those around him. And word became known that he was very good at God helping him to interpret dreams. And one day the king had a dream which none of his wise men could answer. But rumor had it that there was this exile, a Jewish believer, whom God seemed to help in many ways, one of them being interpreting dreams. And so the king asked for Daniel to be brought, and Daniel interpreted his dream. And Daniel, I suspect, tried to lead that king into the kingdom, because the king himself says some things that hardly anybody, even in the Bible, says. And I don't think this king came up with this by himself. I can't find the text. I've lost my place here. But he said something to the effect, Daniel, in you dwells the holy gods. He uses even the plural, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Somebody had to kind of explain that to him. He says, in you dwells the holy living God, so that you can tell me the meaning of my dreams. He recognized that God was dwelling within the life of Daniel. And Daniel demonstrated that God was living in there by the way he helped people like the king. It wasn't for money. It wasn't for a promotion. It wasn't to get a better job in the bureaucracy. Wherever God would lead him to help someone, Daniel took that opportunity. And it was a short time after that that Babylon was invaded by the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. They captured the city, and they hired Daniel as one of their workers. And about that time, if you recall your biblical history, Esther is made the wife of one of the Persian kings, and she and that Persian king have a son whose name is Cyrus, who was the king who issued the decree that Israel could go back and rebuild the temple. So even though you're hundreds and maybe thousands of miles away from home, and you think God's temple cannot be built, and certainly not in you, Daniel turns all of that on its head. And God builds his temple in Daniel. God leads a Jewish girl to marry the king of Persia. They have a son. He issues the decree for Israel to go back and rebuild the temple. So when Israel gets back to rebuild the temple, of course, they do the first thing first, that is to build their own house. They don't build the temple right away. It takes years before they even get started. So God has to send them prophets to say, guys, I brought you back here. Yes, you need a house. But you're spending all of your time paneling your nice house. And you're doing nothing for my temple. I want you to build my temple. That was the prophetic word from Haggai. And it says the people began to build the temple. And God came to Haggai and he said to Haggai, very interesting thing. He said, Haggai, I want you to go to the people and I want you to tell them that the very moment that they lay the first foundation stone in that temple, I want you to tell them that I am beginning in the heavenlies to bless them. Immediately, he says, I will bless you immediately. And that's the way God works. When I'm serious about building God's temple in my life, God says, I'm on it. The blessings start now. You may not see the blessings yet, because blessings are both spiritual and material. Sometimes we see the material. But God commits himself to say, the minute you get serious about building my temple in your life, I begin the blessing immediately. And that's where a lot of Christians get into trouble, because they don't see enough blessing. The blessing doesn't seem to be happening around them. But the spiritual reality around us is just as important as the material reality. And sometimes God can't trust us with too much material things too early, because we'd misuse them. So we have to let him decide when we're going to have the material blessings. But it's a known fact that when people, especially poor people, become Christians, their whole social status rises dramatically. Unfortunately, for many Christians, they reach a certain plateau, material, successful plateau, and that's where they sit. Because now they've got the good life. And they don't realize that was only supposed to be the beginning. That was only the beginning of me trying to find a way to minister to other people like Daniel was. Daniel wasn't even interested in building a house, let alone a temple in Babylon. He wasn't planning on staying. I don't think he ever came back, but if ever the opportunity would come, he would go. He wasn't building for that future. He was building for an eternal future. We don't even know for sure the exact job that he had working for the king of Babylon or the kings of Media and Persia. We don't even know for sure what his job was or what his pay was. But we sure know that he got a book written in the Bible. We sure know that he prayed for God's people to get back. We sure know that King Nebuchadnezzar knew that the living God lived within him. That God had built a living temple within that man. And he was willing to sacrifice whatever it took even to lose his masculinity and not get bitter and not hold resentments, not be mad at the people who failed God and led him to have to go there and to lose his masculinity. He didn't have that. He didn't keep that bitterness. He didn't hold on to that resentment. He said, God, I will let you build your temple in me. And if I never get back, I will demonstrate the presence of your kingdom in my life. And why was he able to do that? It's very simple. It's because he was a man of faith. He believed in God. He believed in the promises of God. God promised from Moses on that if you will walk with me in my ways, I will bless you in ways you cannot understand, and I will put a reward for you in heaven that you cannot even see right now. That's called faith. It's me allowing God to build in me what he wants to do, not just for the better life I'm going to get here. I am going to get that. But what am I investing up there? Because that's where it all is going to end. That's where it's all going. That's the purpose of it. So that I can be a faithful servant in his next kingdom. So that he can trust me with responsibility when he establishes his kingdom down here. And he needs a few good bakers. He needs a few good garbage collectors. He needs a few good whatever. But there aren't many of them out there. But those are the people who are going to be put in positions of authority. Because they were faithful. And that's why he wants to build this temple in us. It doesn't matter how late you start in this process, how much water has gone under the bridge. That has nothing to do with it. You can begin today walking with God and letting him build that temple and have the faith that he will bless. Even if you don't see it immediately, he will bless in ways you cannot imagine. I want to close with a prayer. Whatever this prayer that you can say between you and God, I leave it between you and him. Dear Jesus, I thank you that you have made me. And I confess that I have not always let your glory shine through my life. But today, I am choosing to do the hard work of building your holy temple, your presence in my life. By faith, I believe as I do this, that your blessings will begin immediately, and that you can help me to reach the full measure of your glory that you intended for my life. In your name, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Thank you, guys. Clock says 11. Hey. Thank you.